All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started. I'm Matt Carter, a director at Grants Plus, and I'm joined today by Dana Textoris, who is one of our managing directors, and we are glad that you are all here with us today. So a couple quick things on logistics. Like I mentioned, if you got here a little bit earlier, everyone is on mute automatically, so don't worry about background noise. We sometimes have people worry about, they can't find the mute button. They are on mute. You're all, except for the panelists, you are on mute, so don't worry about that. Today, we've got about 20 minutes of content, and then we'll move on to questions and some discussion at the end. So throughout the presentation, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. Don't wait until the end. If you've got a question as we're going, feel free to submit. And following our presentation today, we will send a recording of the webinar and some other links for resources to help your organization. So know that that is coming. And with that, I will turn it over to Dana.
Well, like Matt said, welcome everyone. It's really great to have you here. We're lucky to have a lot of friends I see and clients joining us, so welcome to you. And I'm also happy to see so many new friends who might not be so familiar with Grants Plus. So for you in particular, Grants Plus is a professional grant-seeking firm. And our mission is helping organizations be confident and successful in the grant-seeking process, no matter where they're starting from. We've been doing this since 2007, partnering with hundreds of nonprofit organizations and foundations across the country to help them form stronger relationships and achieve their grants goals. So following today, if there are any ways that we can help your organization, please don't hesitate to reach out. It would be wonderful to speak with you about your own grant-seeking challenges and opportunities and see if we can be helpful. So let's start today with this very important topic that we're all coming to start with where we are today. And I think what we all, of course, know is that we are at a point of national reckoning about the extent of racism, inequality, and injustice in our society. And of course, this is nothing new. And this is not a new realization for many, especially for the many nonprofits that have been on the front lines of promoting equality and eradicating systemic racism for years. There are also funders that have made equity and racism a funding priority for years. However, following recent events and rising calls for change, funding for racial justice is recently a higher priority for some funders and a new priority for others. So where we are now is that there's a larger share of our society and our sector waking up to the urgent need that we all must address racism. More organizations and more funders are willing to have honest conversations about the effects of racism, both internally and externally, and to do something about it. And I think what we all need to commit to is this being a long-term, sustained commitment in order to produce meaningful change. And there's something I want to say about Grants Plus coming into this conversation, which is that we too are committed to doing our part to challenge the status quo and to help our sector produce the change that we want to see. And in being self-aware and being transparent, we're not coming to this webinar claiming that we, Grants Plus, are the expert on diversity, equity, inclusion, and ending racism. In fact, we're on a journey along with so many other organizations who are recognizing how much we have to learn. How much room we have to grow as we strive to be part of a more diverse sector and create a more just and equitable world. But what we are experts in at Grants Plus is understanding and interpreting trends in grant funding and in the behaviors of funders. And we know that equity and structural racism are a growing focus area for philanthropy. And it's one that we're following and tracking closely, which is exactly why we're so happy to be on this webinar today to share some of these insights with you.
So to cover quickly what we're going to talk about today, we're going to discuss a few different areas, including how nonprofits are working to address racism, how funders are supporting this work, and how to discuss your equity work with your funders. So this kind of shows up in several different ways. There's a couple different pathways where our sector is addressing racial justice and America's legacy of racism. So some organizations are taking on structural racism head on. There are several organizations doing this and probably more taking it on as we go. But there are many more organizations that provide services that address the consequences of racism and structural inequality, such as poverty, chronic health issues, and educational disparities. And I'm hopeful that some of these organizations are now emboldened to make a more direct connection between those consequences and the structures that produce them. As Dana alluded to, we also are on our own journey. So we have to acknowledge that many nonprofits are working to address the effects of structural racism within their own organizations. So for many organizations, this has meant perhaps falling short on building diverse boards and leadership teams, or attempting to provide opportunities for community voices in program development and problem solving, and still working to do that in better ways. So today we're going to discuss how grant makers are responding to racial inequity with grant funding opportunities, and how nonprofits can demonstrate the strongest alignment to be competitive for these opportunities. And we will say that nonprofits that fail to address this may do so at their own peril.
So let's talk first about that first category that Matt just mentioned, which is the organizations tackling racism head-on and dismantling systemic inequalities. So what we know is that there are some funders who have an established track record of funding racial justice for years and even decades. But in recent weeks of unrest, we've seen other funders make changes to their grant making, and some to newly prioritize a racial justice focus for the first time. So what are we looking at when we look at the emergence of these new funding programs in the last month or so? We're seeing that the majority of new funding programs are directing funds to organizations that are specifically and directly working to dismantle systemic racism according to a vision of long-term systems change. And this may be opposed to hyper-local or short-term efforts, or as Matt said, efforts some of the other efforts. And often this comes in the form of funding initiatives like advocacy, public education, coalition building, and other large-scale systemic reform efforts. So as we understand that funders are looking to make these investments, and that there are organizations that have been doing this work that want to optimize their opportunity to get that funding, we're looking at what are we seeing in terms of the trends of what funders are prioritizing. And recently, one of our trusted philanthropy partners posed a question on LinkedIn. And this question received feedback from a variety of funders and others who are invested in this area. And the question that our friend had posed was that she had a funder wanting to invest $500,000 towards racial and social justice efforts. And she asked, how should I direct this funder to make a meaningful investment? And some of the feedback that she received was, one, about the types of initiatives that this funder ought to consider funding in order to have the greatest impact. And they included voter mobilization and registration efforts, addressing high eviction rates, education reform, criminal justice reform, workforce development, and many other areas. And I think what this told us is that there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer, but rather that there's a broad scope of work required to end systemic racism, and that different funders are going to prioritize different initiatives that align to their own vision and values. Perhaps what's more instructive is the expectation that was expressed that grantees need to demonstrate a strong reputation among social justice leaders, that they have the capacity and infrastructure to drive long-term change work, that they focus on initiatives that are led by people of color, and that they possess a clearly defined strategic plan and have well-articulated goals that identify key obstacles and solutions to address them. So what this all adds up to is that there is a high bar among funders looking to invest in this work to make sure that they are funding the organizations that demonstrate the greatest capacity and most trusted reputation to do this work. While we all want to see the philanthropic community commit to funding anti-racism work, and we applaud the many new funding programs that are springing up, we also want to note that it's fair that we need to maintain perspective, and that's because of the reality of past experience. Borealis Philanthropy is one of those funders that has a long-term track record in investing in racial justice movements. And we're aware that they have put out something of a warning, which is that in all of our optimism and that we're glad to see these new funding opportunities open up, they gave a warning that we've seen this before. And that following the death of Michael Brown in 2014, not very long ago, there was then too a rise in focus on funding racial justice among funders. And unfortunately, gradually, that focus dissipated. And as time passed, many funders who had mounted those programs returned to their traditional grant-making priorities and sort of lost that focus on racial justice. So in recognizing that this is happening again, there's this mounting effort to fund efforts to dismantle systemic racism. How can we participate differently and prevent that gradual retreat from a philanthropic focus on racial justice, which we know we need to sustain? And one thing we need to do is be prepared to be honest and engage with funders differently. The organizations that are doing this work and those of us who are donors and partners to support them need to inform and remind funders that dismantling systemic racism is systems level work that does not fit neat programmatic models. It won't satisfy funders who expect to see goals reached and outcomes met by the end of the grant period. This is work that must happen. And so it requires that funders tolerate a long-term funding commitment and a different approach to grant making. And part of this might come in positive peer pressure between funders. So Borealis Philanthropy, for example, has called on the funding community to make long overdue changes in how they make their grants, including one, listening to Black-led organizations and investing in Black-led movements, diversifying their boards and their boards of trustees and their leadership teams, and sustaining these commitments beyond an immediate crisis commitment. So this again is all to say that while we have reason to be optimistic about this, we have to keep up a drumbeat that it continue. What Grants Plus is doing in a space right now is to take the opportunity to see where that funding is coming from. So that we can help organizations that are doing this work to seize those opportunities for funding. In the last several weeks, our team has jumped in to do research, to identify funding opportunities, and to create an online resource center that gathers together grants for racial justice and efforts to confront structural inequality. So after today's webinar, we're going to send out some information about this page so that those of you doing this work can come to it as a resource. And please note that we're going to be updating this as we continue to see new funding opportunities be announced. Matt has himself been leading our team's work to do this research and compile this online resource. So he's going to share with us some of the observations that our team has had in doing this work.
Great, thank you, Dana. And these that you're seeing on your screen now are a couple examples that I think are fairly illustrative of what is out there for grants working on taking on systemic racism head on. So a few of these examples, the General Services Foundation that's up there, fairly typical of what people are looking for. They want to amplify visions and voices of leaders who are advancing a bold vision for a just world. So that means that in taking on that mission, they have moved from issue-specific funding to support organizations that are contributing to a broad, sustainable, and intersectional movement. So, as Dana mentioned, this is moving from limited program areas and traditional grant making to a more bold vision of long-term and non-issue specific funding. Hill Snowden Foundation is similar. They seek to improve the material and socio-political conditions of low-income families and communities. And one of the things to point out with them that is, again, illustrative of a lot of these funders is that they believe the most effective way to do this is through Black-led efforts and minority-led efforts to create social change. So that is key in a lot of these funders. The Solidaire Network is also interesting because they are actually a community of donors. They're not a single foundation, but they are providing rapid response funding to frontline organizations, especially for those working on organizing right now in the wake of everything going on. So their priorities within that are building power to challenge oppressive systems and confronting the root causes of oppression. So they're an interesting one on there. But everything is not a broad-based national effort. We're seeing some focused areas in specific program areas and some local level commitments. So for example, the Certina Foundation, a large national funder, they are actually focusing their racial injustice efforts in arts and culture. So they are looking to fund artists of color who work with communities to imagine and build racially just systems at a local scale. And also to create more research and criticism of the art by artists of color, and advancing the role of artists of color in shaping public policy. So that's an interesting take on this work within a program area. And also, not everything is national. If you look at our resource, you'll see there are some local resources up there. So as an example of that, the Eli Lilly Foundation, not to be confused with the Lilly Endowment, is Eli Lilly's corporate foundation based in Indianapolis. And they are seeking to decrease the burden of racial injustice and its effects on communities of color in Indianapolis and its surrounding counties. So again, sort of that national focus, but within, or national focus of activities, but within the local area, really looking at what local organizers are doing to improve things in Indianapolis. So I am actually also going to move on to the third category that we talked about, or second category of communities impacted by racism. So beyond organizations that are addressing the effects of racism directly, many, if not most, nonprofits are affected by systemic racism in one way or another. Essentially, almost any organization that serves people of color can see the effects of racial inequity. And you can see on your screen some examples of this across various things. So, working in hunger, minority households are almost twice as twice as likely to face hunger. Within culture, we see, have seen surveys where people of color report feeling that, large cultural institutions are not for them. Etc. You can see all this up on your screen. A great example of this is actually for those of you who follow Nonprofit AF and know Voulet. He has a story about how he gave a presentation on how nonprofits see the effects of racism in our work, and was approached actually by the leader of a cancer organization afterwards who said, cancer doesn't discriminate. So Vu sort of ruminated on that for a minute and wrote a later column that says cancer does discriminate, largely because Black women and white women get breast cancer at about the same rate, but Black women die from breast cancer at twice the same rate. Also, in comparison with other racial and ethnic groups in the United States, Vietnamese women experience the highest incidence of cervical cancer. So things that you think would not discriminate actually do. So the odds are good that you already have a sense of how those you serve, your organization serves, are affected by racism. But if not, now is the moment to understand if and how they are. So as we saw on the last slide, the effects may not be obvious, but they're likely there. Once you have identified how structural racism impacts those you serve and your work, as more and more funders are focusing on the effects of racism, your organization should be prepared to talk about how a legacy of inequity impacts those you serve, and if possible, what the organization will do about it. So a great example of this is organizations that are working on infant mortality in African American communities will cite research where the rate of infant mortality is correlated to race independent of access to healthcare, income, et cetera. So many of them have really worked on taking on structural racism within what they're doing, on top of the public health work they're doing, the prenatal efforts, all of that, have added this to what they're doing as a dimension, because all of their other efforts are going to be for naught if structural racism is not also addressed. So as more funders focus their efforts on racism, we had to be prepared to talk about how that legacy impacts those that we serve. And really, I think Dana said this is a rare opportunity to capture funders' attention on the underlying causes of so much of what we do. And some funders are already elevating the importance of addressing systemic racism as part of organizations' ongoing work. So we have an example here of the George Gunn Foundation. So they have for a long time supported some core areas in education, community development, culture, climate, and social justice. But now they are asking grant seekers to discuss how their work will address and improve racial equity within each of those subject areas. So for example, if you are going to them for a grant because you're working on climate change, you have got to be prepared to address the disproportionate effects of climate change on minority communities. It can't just be broadly about climate change. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dana to talk about our sector a little bit.
Thank you. I was on mute. The third area that Matt had mentioned that organizations may be seeking funding for is addressing how racism and how inequality manifests within our organizations. And that's something that we need to address, that there are issues that are not easily solved, but that we can be aware that as a sector, there is work to do to build diversity and build equality. We see this when we look at board diversity. We see this when we look at the diversity of our leadership teams, our staff. When we look at how do the communities that we serve show up and have an empowered space at the table. This is all important work that we need to do as a sector. Matt, you can go to the next slide. And what we know is that not only is this work that we need to do, but that funders also have encouraged diversity, greater diversity in the sector for years. And this is something that we've seen in the course of preparing grant proposals for a long time, that many funders require information about the demographic makeup of an organization's service population, staff, board, and senior leadership. What we're expecting now is that these requirements will intensify and become standard among more funders in the immediate and near future. Funders are increasingly not only going to ask, but expect to see that grantees are making meaningful efforts to diversify their boards and their leadership teams. An example of this is ArtsWave in Cincinnati. They've announced new expectations that in order to continue receiving full funding, grantees must have a board-approved diversity, equity, and inclusion and access plan, and be demonstrating markers of progress in diversifying their staffs and boards. So it's very important that organizations be self-aware. That one, if you're already doing this work, if you can already demonstrate meaningful progress to diversify and build inclusion within your staff and board, speak about that with your funders. It may help set the bar within your community and make your proposal stand out among others. Not to mention, of course, the meaningful reasons to do so, which have been documented to include enhanced innovation, better decision-making, and even a more diligent and hardworking team. So all the reasons why it's important to be doing this work. An example of an organization that really, I think, walks the talk in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion is University Settlement here in Cleveland, where we are based. In the last 2 years, University Settlement has expanded the percentage of people of color on their board from 16% to almost 40%. And they have made efforts to ensure that their board includes residents of the community that they serve. And furthermore, to ensure that their programs and services are driven by the community they serve, they've invested in an ongoing process of engaging local residents in conversations to understand what matters most to them, and then to include them in efforts to carry that work out. So if you're an organization that is still making progress, share that progress with your funders. Hold your own organization to a high bar, and make sure that that progress is authentic and not cosmetic. So, for example, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that while one survey found that 55% of arts and culture organizations nationally have a formal diversity statement, only 22% have a diversity strategy with true potential to drive action and change. And then finally, if your organization simply does not have a plan or a commitment to address diversity, well, what can you do? I think what you'll need to do is to check your own expectations about the success that you may find as you continue to reach out to funders.
Great. And one last thing before we move over to questions and answers is how do we go about conveying this commitment to funders? So even if your work is not directly focused on addressing inequality, it's important that you demonstrate to funders that you are aware of its effects on those you serve and that you are doing what you can to address it. So for example, even if you're doing a small part to address a large problem, like the example up there about providing fresh food, there are structural reasons why some communities don't have fresh food, and you can cite those in what you're doing to provide fresh food. The other thing too is this is a good time to call attention to the root causes of what you're doing based on structural racism. So again, the example up there talks about, yes, you're doing what you were doing, but this is what it's rooted in. So making sure that funders know that. But while you're doing that, make sure you are avoiding euphemisms for uncomfortable words. And this is, again, something our sector has been talking about for a while. You want to use language that empowers and clearly identifies the people that you serve, and avoid placing blame for systemic issues on individuals. So for example, words like underserved and underrepresented that we all use all the time can obscure the reality that what we actually mean by those is usually Black or minority. This usage really kind of indirectly disparages an entire group of people and also misses the opportunity to connect with communities and cultures that can happen when your language is specific. Also, euphemistic language can unperson the very people that we're trying to help. So deficit-based language like at risk or marginalized can really obscure who you're talking about. So things like replacing that with asset-based language would get rid of things like at risk with experiencing marginalization due to systemic barriers. So if you look at the example here, our first is that, says very, very generally, there are underserved people who are at risk without really talking about much. The second identifies who the participants in this program are, which is Black and Hispanic high school students, and what barriers they are facing, so barriers to their success. This simply states who is served and does not place them in any category, and identifies what challenges they are facing, not that they are assumed to be at risk of anything. So with that, I want to turn it over to Q&A, and we've had a couple come in. We've only got, unfortunately, about 2 minutes here. But we've had one come in that says, an interesting one. It says, I work in state government, and we are beginning a systemic race equity effort within our agency. Are there funders that will help fund this work on a government level, and how do I find them? And Dana, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a crack at that first.
Please.
I would say at a state level, it might be a little more difficult. At a local level, it would be easier. But I think especially if you are partnering with your agency, if you are partnering with other organizations, there's absolutely an opportunity for you to go to some of the national funders and say, we are looking to make this change within our state, and here are our partners. Here's what we would like to do. And you may get some traction on that. As for finding them, check our resource guide. Dana, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think that was great.
Great. We have a couple of questions here that say, will the slides be available after the presentation? Just a reminder that we are going to send a recording out with some other resources to everyone. And one other question that I actually don't know the answer to, beyond some stuff that I've seen, can you discuss changes you're seeing in willingness to fund 501c4s in this climate? Tina, do you have anything on that?
I think that that's something that we're watching for. I think, it's certainly the case that there's been grant funding for 501c4 organizations. It's been limited in the past, but I do expect that we may see that those C4s are often they're acting in a space that, C3s can't, and it may be likely that funding follows. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and I agree. I've seen sort of some discussion on that, among philanthropists of whether that will be a thing. So definitely we'll keep an eye on that. But I think the opportunity is probably more open than it has been in the past. So unfortunately, we are trying to respect everybody's time here. We've got almost out of time. But want to highlight a couple of resources. Obviously, we said we will send along the recording of the webinar. But also, as Dana mentioned in the beginning, do not be afraid to reach out for a free consultation with one of our senior experts. I promise it's not a sales gimmick. We will actually have a meaningful conversation with you. And don't forget to check out our page with grant opportunities for addressing structural racism. So thank you everyone for joining us. We've got our contact info up here. And our next webinar is going to be on July 29th, and that is about leveraging your application or your successful funding for emergency funding for COVID-19 into a longer term relationship with the funder. So thank you everyone for attending, and look for an email with the recording soon.
Thanks, everyone.